communication experience and engagement here at ISCO, the International Students and Programs Office. Congrats to you for registering ahead for sessions or coming early, being on the wait list and still getting in. One thing you'll quickly learn about UC San Diego is come early and register. That's how you get through. All of our events are first come, first serve, meaning if you come too late and the food is gone, the food is gone. So look at you eating, happy. Yay. Love to see it. Love to see it. All right, hopefully you've been getting to know the people around you a little bit at your table. You don't have their name, if they're a grad or undergrad student, maybe what they're studying, maybe their home country. I also want to say hello. This is my first hybrid session, so I need your grace. But hi to our Zoom folks. I have my wonderful colleague Karina, who's going to be managing the Zoom chat. But we are going to do our best to do a hybrid session. So if you see Bruno, what's up, Bruno? We're going to interact a little bit, both in person as well as via the chat. Okay, let's see if I can make this smaller. A little bit about how we're going to spend our time together today. We'll do a brief overview of who is ISCO, because I'm assuming you are all new students. Love it. We'll talk a little bit, we'll do most of it as the activity, because I hate presentations where someone talks at you for an hour. That is a slow, painful death. We don't need to do that today. So the majority of our time will be activity, and then we'll touch on some intercultural communication theory at the end. We're already to the activity. Gotta love it. I'm going to ask you a series of prompts or statements. And if you're online, you're going to type into the chat how much that resonates with you. If you're sitting by someone, you're going to talk to someone. How much does that resonate with you? So I'm going to read out the statement. And if you're like, that is 100% me, I want you to say so. If you're like, there is no way that I could ever be that person, I want to hear it. And if you're somewhere in the middle, you're like, it depends on. I would also like to hear that. So you're going to share with your neighbor, and then I'm going to ask you to raise your hand, and we'll take a few to share out. Okay, some community guidelines. When talking about your personal experience, it's always good to talk about your personal experience. So using I statements is a great way to do that. If you notice that you are talking a lot for someone like me, who is very shy, the idea of step up, step back means if you're someone who is talking a lot, I might invite you to step back, because that creates space for others. If you realize that you haven't shared yet during today's session, I might invite you to step up, raise your hand so that we can hear from you as well. If I notice that you haven't shared at all, I might call on you. And then finally, we are all learning from each other. So the meat of this session is the fact that we all come from different life experiences. That's what intercultural communication is all about. So it's really your ability to share your life experience that adds value to this session. Okay, let's get into it. My first prompt is I feel comfortable smiling at people I don't know. Turn to your neighbor and discuss. I think they did, but I was going to back out. Okay. Now first, I want to hear from my folks. Raise your hand. You need a second. I want to hear from my folks who are like, that is 100% me. I smile at everyone I don't know. Unsurprisingly, the people saying that are some of those people. Let's start. Can you say your name and why you smile at people you don't know?
Yeah, so my name is Richard, and I realized that if you smile at someone, it's smile back at you, and that way you can get to meet more people.
I love it. I love it. Let's go over here.
So, this is Terry.
What's your name?
My name is Marina,
Love it.
and I am smiling a lot because I'm so glad to be here.
Oh.
And also, e aí, Bruno, beleza? And that's it. I'm just really glad to be here and enjoy it.
Very in the high. And then we'll go here and then we'll.
So I'm still and like I just find it and I don't know, it just makes me smile.
Okay, now I'm gonna hear from folks who are like, no, I just don't smile at people I don't know because I don't know them. Do we have any folks who are that's not quite as common for you to smile at people you don't know? Yes, thank you. I love some diversity. And you can say your name and why.
Hi, my name is Alex, and I don't feel to smile that much. Seeing people in India, I don't know, but hearing you I really want to know them. I really want to talk to them. So it's a totally different culture, and I love that. So now I have been trying to smile.
Aditya is stealing my talking points. He's already saying in different contexts, this behavior is different, right? So maybe I see a lot of potentially our Indian students who are like smiling and smiling. Because what might have been quote unquote normal in your home country is not quote unquote normal in a new country. Totally. What about some folks who are in between? You're like, it depends on.
It depends on situation. Like I can smile at random people if they're also looking at me making eye contact. If I smile and wave and if I expect a miss, then it will be very awkward.
Oh, what's your name?
I'm Aishwarya.
Okay, wonderful. And then I also okay. Tianjan, I want to hear from you. Tianjan, are you able to unmute and share? And if I can ask these folks to quiet down, because I think if we can hear from Tianjan, I want to hear it. Tianjan, are you able to unmute?
Hello.
Yes, okay, so you don't know.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sometimes if I see some people I find like if they're good looking today, I would just smile at them. Or like a couple, they're like looking really sweet, I would smiling at them, something like that.
I love that. I love your reasons. Thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a little bit of a anecdote, if you will, that relates to this prompt. So I'm originally from Chicago, which is Midwest of the U.S. And if you know anything about Chicago, it's like the friendly farm folk of the United. And so we're known for being like super smiley, super chatty. Like you're in line at a grocery store, and it's not uncommon to like strike up a conversation with a stranger. I'm like, oh, how's the weather today? Buying milk, a little dairy, like it's a whole thing, right? Then I moved to California for my undergrad, and in my experience, California was maybe like smile at a stranger, but not necessarily strike up a conversation with a stranger. So I kind of had to like read the room a little bit and like tone it down. Really, like, okay. So then I was, for my undergraduate program, I spent a year in Florence, Italy. So I spent one of my years studying abroad there. And I had this really interesting phenomenon start to happen to me in which I was approached by a lot of men. And my first thought was, I've arrived. Here I am, recognizing me for who I've always been, and I'm finally coming into my own. But then it started to happen like too much, and I was like, what's going on? I was an international relations major. I was studying intercultural communication, and actually one of my Italian professors pulled me aside one day, and she was like, Grace, I just feel like I need to let you know that in Italian culture, for a woman to make eye contact with a man and then smile at him can be perceived as an invitation for him to romantically approach her. So think back to college Grace, who's just like. So we can see that different behaviors can already start to have different meanings in different contexts. Right. Let's go ahead to. It is customary for me. To hug family or friends when I greet them. All right, so turn to your neighbor and share. Is it customary for you to hug? Also, you in the chat. I want to know. Here, who you always, and maybe you do more, maybe you do besos, maybe you do, yeah, you're gonna say like, okay, so I saw, let's start, so your name and your, yes, Daniel? Yeah.
I'm Daniel.
Oh, yeah. It's really customized to close friends. We just say hi and goodbye with a heart, but we just make conversations also. And they also keep like pesos. And they're just saying, family like different men and women, but the frequently they also like they do it with my friends, their friends.
Yeah.
I think Argentina they do it. But we don't do that as a family. Yes, we come.
Yeah.
And you can
Yep. Okay, I love it. Thanks for sharing. Did I see any hands over here? All right, let's move to our folks who are like, yeah, that's not going to be me. I am not that person. Yes. And then I can just say your name and yeah, share your experience. I am very not touchy person. Hugs are for very, very, very special people. Oh, thank you so much for sharing it now. That's perfect. Who else? Who else is like, that's not me? Sorry, Rob. Yeah.
So yeah, my name is Omkar and I'm from India and I don't think like Sabina in Indian thing. So like if
Yes.
we want to like because our parents speak or something like that. I remember the last time I hugged was when I was leaving India. That was
There you go. So good. Okay, so I want to hear from some of our folks online. Okay, Bruno, you said yes. Are you able to unmute yourself? And if you can, turn on your camera. Bruno, we want to hear from you.
Hi, in Brazil, it is customary to hug everyone that you know well. So friends and family, like if I'm getting to know someone, I will probably just shake hands. But if I already know them, I hug them and sometimes like also kiss them in the cheek. I don't know if it's also, yeah.
That's perfect. Thanks so much, Bruno. And then I also want to hear from Linda, who said not usually. Linda, what's your experience?
So if I haven't seen them in a long time or if they're leaving, like one of my best friends, she left for Irvine yesterday. So I did hug her then. But usually, or like if something really tragic happened, like there's a physics test tomorrow, I would hug them. But not usually. Yeah.
Physics calls for a hug, nothing else does. Okay, so good. So what I love about this one is that you're starting to see, in the last example, the way I talked about like culture and how you navigate culture was pretty regionally based, right? So I talked about how I was from Chicago, but then I moved to California, but then I went to Italy, and in different places, there were different cultures. So while that can be the case, that's not always the case, right? there are a lot of different layers of culture and there are a lot of different ways they interact. So it can be regional, let's say like international, national, the region in the US. There's also like organizational culture. So the culture of a workplace. UC San Diego very much has its own culture. There's also personal, like family culture, and then personal culture, like personality. And at any given time, you are navigating all those different cultures. So I've heard a lot of students say, like in my home country, you did not hug people. But then when I started coming to UC San Diego, like all my friends hugged me. So I was just like, right? Or they were like, I came to UC San Diego and I learned about a little thing called consent. And that, oh, maybe we shouldn't touch people unless we're like invited to or allowed to. And so that's all culture, right? Of you navigating different contexts and finding out what's quote unquote normal, because what is normal? Like normal is normative given a certain context. And so you all are already very, like I would say probably much more adept because you've already started to do that. You've already started to go in between different contexts and kind of ascertain what's quote unquote normal in this context versus another one. And what might be normal for my family could be different in like this university setting versus our friends versus all these different situations. Or you could be like me, where I'm very much a hugger, but I had to learn that not everyone wants to be touched all the time. It's good life lessons. Okay, it is customary for me to take off my shoes before entering a home. Turn to your neighbor and discuss. Okay, so who are my folks where you always take off your shoes? Lots of hands, lots of good people to speak from. I'm gonna go over here. Let's start over here. Why are you? If you introduce yourself.
I'm going to payment. I think it's not desperate.
Okay.
So just getting to the plan.
Oh.
Yeah, obviously, I think taking your shoes off is not like customary, it's mandatory thing. If you don't remove your shoes off, I think it will send you out. But I'm getting used to it, yeah. Because I think there's no dust.
Totally, that's perfect. It's perfect. Did you have your hand raised as well? Yeah. Awesome. Introduce yourself and share.
Hi. Yeah, we always go to either my friend's house or my room, my house.
Great. Do I have any brave folks? If you're looking for seats, you can sit here too. Who I know this is very dominant, this group on taking shoes off. Anyone who doesn't take their shoes off? Yeah, yes, thank you. Okay, let's start you and then you.
Starting for long time, we used to do that. And now I am doing it in my front.
So how did you know to start doing it?
It was very important.
Wow, okay, I love it. That's great.
Yeah, I'm also it's not just your mind authority that I take off just like inside the house. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So good. That's so good. Okay, and then I want to switch to my folks. I am probably mispronouncing your name, so I would love to pronounce it correctly if I can. So, Supisara, can you unmute and share? You said yes. I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear.
Like I don't know. Maybe it's just dirty, like all the dust and dirt from the shoes.
Yep. Kind of this idea of if you don't clean the home, you don't get to dirty the home. I love it. I love it. Okay. Thanks so much for sharing. So, what I love about this one is typically very strong feelings arise. Of like, it's not like it's customer, it's mandatory. If you don't take your shoes, the door's there. You can leave. But what's really interesting about this is that as I've heard from different people, oftentimes it's the same ethic, but it's the exact opposite behavior. So the ethic is what I've noticed is that it's this care for the other. It's a respect for the other. So think about taking off your shoes. You're like, I know that I'm a guest. And so out of a sign of respect, entering someone else's home, I'm going to take off my shoes because I want to care for the home. I want to respect the home that I'm about to enter into. However, I've also heard students say, in my context, I don't take off my shoes because I know I'm a guest. So to take off my shoes is almost like making myself too comfortable. Like I'm going to take off my shoes, I'm going to hop in the shower, when it's dinner, I'll be there. Like it's almost like because you know you're the guest, you keep your shoes on. I've also heard students say they keep their shoes on and their families do because in their home country, it's really common to have cold floors. So let's say tile floors or concrete floors. And so in order that the guest feels comfortable, they keep their shoes on so that their feet aren't cold or they don't get sick. But we don't usually talk about this stuff, right? Like we don't sit down and you're like, do you smell at people? Or do you take off your shoes when you first? I'm honestly so impressed that you all had a verbal conversation about it. Because so often, so many of these behaviors are our nonverbal cues, but there are also our nonverbal cues where we typically make our first impression of people. And if we grew up thinking, maybe not even intentionally, that something is quote unquote normal, and then we interact with someone where maybe their behavior is directly the opposite of what we think is respectful, what do you think our first impression of that person is going to be? Interesting, right? Exactly, the last impression. And so this is why I love intercultural communication is that we're trying to like peel back these layers of what are all these things that we think are normal, that are really just normative for a certain context, and how can we start to get curious about how do I show up, how does someone else show up, and what are different reasons for doing so? All right, our last prompt. It is acceptable for me to arrive 10 minutes late to an appointment. Okay. So let's start with my folks who are like absolutely not. I would never dream of showing up. Some people they read this and it's going to say, this gives me anxiety. The thought of showing up late gives me anxiety. Do we have any of Korea's like that? Do we have any of those folks? Do you introduce yourself and share?
Hi, I'm Vaishnavi, and I am on the position for the
personal party.
Yes, so it's a personal thing where I just cannot be late, so I always make sure that it's there on time, and I also make sure to inform of the schedule. I'm always paranoid, I said it makes that. I get paranoid, I don't want to do it.
Totally. So good. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else who'd like that? Yeah.
I tell my friends different times so that they arrive on time. I give us half an hour before time that you just reach that time at least. I know for sure they're going to be late.
You're like, I know you.
Yeah, you get the train or public transport to catch. I have to tell them be there at that time. I'll not tell them when the train is or when the bus is. Just reach there that time.
I love it. I love that. Okay, what about some folks on the other end of the spectrum? Who should, or maybe it's not like acceptable, but it happens. Here we are living our lives.
I'm Sakita, I'm from India. So generally for me, if majority of the people who are attending are Indian, then when they say 8 o'clock, it means 8:30 for me. So if there are other cultures involved, or if there's like an interview that's going to happen, then maybe I'll show up 10 minutes earlier.
Totally. So that was such a great response because it's also trying to highlight of what we mean by appointment.
Yeah.
A lot of students are like, what do you mean by appointment? And I'm like, what do you mean? Because we have different cultural expectations depending on what it is. Totally. I think, did you raise your hands?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm Aditi, I'm from India. I agree with her. So it depends on the people you're going out with.
I love it.
And even the event.
So good. Yes, yes. Okay, let's go to some folks in the chat. Linda, absolutely not. Again, I might be mispronouncing your name, so please correct me. Pagan, we haven't heard from you, so I'd love for you to unmute yourself and share.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, in my experience, usually it isn't an issue. If I apologize nicely enough afterwards, people will usually let me off the hook.
So you're gonna be late, but you're gonna like ask, you don't ask for permission, you ask for forgiveness.
Sometimes both. Depending on what the issue, depending on what you mean by appointment, but chances are I'm probably going to be late.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into this slide right now because we have a whole slide next to it. But similarly, this one also tends to arise very strong emotions. Because for a lot of people, time and respect are very much tied. And so how you treat someone's time can for some be a reflection of how you respect them. But there's also different understandings of how you treat time. And so again, we'll get into that a little bit later. Okay, this is my joke. Intercultural communication in 5 slides. Obviously, people take courses on this. They like study this. We are just going to brush the tip of the iceberg. And if you've ever studied intercultural communication before, that's a joke for you because culture is often referred to as an iceberg. So there you go. But for the sake of today, we're going to talk about these dimensions on the screen. Okay. So the first one we're going to talk about is peach versus coconut culture. This is the first culture dimension. You might be like, Grace, I love summer, but why are we talking about peaches and coconuts? Okay, so peach versus coconut is essentially an analogy for how we might make relationships. What do we think is quote unquote normal behavior when you're interacting with someone for the first time to like make that initial relationship? So for the purpose of this, we'll use a lot of spectrums as like our medium. So on one end of the spectrum, you're going to have peaches. And peaches are really warm and fuzzy on the outside, right? So they're typically really smiley, they're really chatty, they're like very friendly to people they just met. That's a peach. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, you'll find coconuts. And coconuts have more of that hard outer shell, right? So for coconut, they're like, why am I going to talk about the weather with someone I'm never going to see again? Like that, what's the point? I don't understand. But typically, when you break through that hard outer shell, what do you find? It's all, you have the coconut milk and the coconut water and the coconut flesh. Like for coconuts, once you kind of pass that initial barrier, like once you're in. And these friends become very close like family. So after this really like brief description, how many How many folks think you might be a little bit more peachy? I'm like the poster child for a peach, so we're together. Right, a little more. How many of you think you might be a little bit more coconut? Ooh, a strong coconut group. I love it. Okay, so for a lot of these cultural dimensions, if you study hog seeds, you will also assign countries to have different cultures, and they'll be rated as such, right? The U.S. is typically seen as more of a peach culture. So you can see, so it says here, the real private self is protected by the hard shell of a pet. And then some say, I've heard a lot of international students say, it's impossible to become quote unquote real friends with Americans. Yeah, I see some nods. And because our expectations for what is normal in creating relationships can be much different. It's so funny because when I give this presentation to Americans, all of them are like, I'm a peach. And then I read this one, and then they're like, I'm not fake. So I think back to myself. And I think back to like college grades. I was an orientation leader, a residential advisor, all the things. And I remember like welcoming new people to campus. And I would be like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. You made it. I'm so glad you arrived. Like, tell me all about yourself. And we talk, and I'd be like, oh, that's so interesting. You know, we should grab coffee sometime. Okay, let's do it. Okay, bye. But if I never follow up with coffee, how do you think that comes across? Maybe fake? Maybe insincere? Maybe disingenuous? But in American culture, it's like, might be perceived as, oh my gosh, I just want to be so friendly and so warm and so welcoming. But there are certain things that you say that you don't necessarily intend on doing, right? Do you all have things like that in your own culture, in your own language? Of like, you just say that because culturally you're expected to say that, but whether or not you actually expect to do it can be much different. However, coconuts might receive that and encounter that and be like, well, screw you. I thought that we just had this like really intentional, like 20-minute conversation, and then you never talked to me again, and I thought we were best friends. It can be really confusing. For a peach interacting with a coconut for the first time, their thoughts might be, they hate me. Because I'm not getting the nonverbal cues I'm so used to. Like if someone's not like super smiley and super chatty, if they're a little bit more reserved, it might be seen as, oh, they just like straight up don't like me. Versus there are different ways for showing up. There are different ways for making first impressions, and there are different ways for making that initial conversation that can become a relationship and can become a friendship. Okay, the next one, communication. So a lot of the times, like layman's terms, we'll talk about indirect or direct communication. If you study intercultural communication theory, you'll hear a lot more about low context versus high context. So on one end of the spectrum, you're going to have low context. So the idea is you don't need a lot of context because the meaning of what's being communicated are in the words that are being used. So that's where you find the meaning of what's being said, is like what words are being used. So you're going to hear phrases like, get to the point, say what you mean, don't beat around the bush. On the other end of the spectrum, you have high context. Because yes, you're listening to the words that are being said, but context matters. So you want to know, what is the context? Am I meeting my professor for office hours, or am I on a first date? Very different contexts. What is my relationship to the person I'm talking with? What are the nonverbal cues? Is someone talking to you like this? Or is someone talking to you like this? Oh, I'm sorry, what? And so context really matters. For those of you who might think, again, I'm doing very, very broad and short descriptions, and we'll dig into it more. How many think you might be a little bit more low context, a little bit more direct? Okay, love it, thank you. I always love it when it's like what group is that? And I see like the 3 grades. Okay, what about high context? A little bit more. Okay, totally. So for this, it's really interesting because my old coworker had a great anecdote that kind of like did a really good job articulating this. So he said in his last job, he had 2 bosses. One's name was Ashley, and she was from Sweden. I mean, she was from the Midwest, and the other one's name was Henrik, and he was from Sweden. And he would have these one-on-ones with his supervisors, and he would meet with Ashley, and he'd be like, hey, this is what I'm focusing on for the week. And Ashley would be like, great, you're doing a great job, that all sounds good. Let's also like maybe throw in this, and that. But overall, you're doing amazing, congrats. And he would leave that one-on-one with Ashley, and he would knock on Henrik's door, and he'd be like, hey, Henrik, I'm just going to tell you this is what Ashley and I met about. And Henrik would look up from his desk and be like, no, that is not what you should be focusing on. You need to focus on this, and this. Like, that's what you need to do. And James would like get back to his desk and sit down and think, what just happened? I had supposedly like the same conversation with 2 different people, but they were very much 2 different conversations. And initially, his takeaway was very simple. Ashley loves me. Henrik hates me. Like, it's purely personal, and it can only be personal. And then he was like, but what was so weird is after working there for like 6 months to a year, I started to realize that what Ashley and Henrik were communicating were typically the very same thing. But Ashley was much more high context. And so because she was his supervisor, I don't know if you all have heard of the sandwich method. She would like start with like affirmation and then put in her feedback. This is what I want you to focus on, and then end with affirmation. And yet it was James' job to know, like, this is my supervisor. I'm meeting with her as a one-on-one. I need to pick apart and realize this is what she's saying. Like, this is what she wants me to focus on. Henrik might have been much more low context. And so he necessarily didn't feel the need. He was like much more comfortable saying, no, this is what I want you to focus on. No. And so James started to realize, like, in some ways I was able to navigate, oh, this is like what more high context could look like, and this is what more low context could look like. But depending on where you are on the spectrum, other ends of the spectrum can feel some type of way. Because if you're a little bit more, let's say, low context, and you're talking to someone who's more high context, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, just say it. Just get to it. We don't have to do this talking dance. You can tell me. I can handle it. But if you're much more high context and you interact with someone who's much more low context than you might be like, oh, you're very abrasive, or like very rude, or like very aggressive. And so again, our first impressions all of a sudden have changed from just behavior to values. Of like, oh, someone's rude, someone's aggressive, or someone's boring, someone's disengaged. And so the whole point of intercultural communication is to notice what's happening as we interact with folks, and to just press pause and say, it's very human and very normal to make first impressions. Our brains process so much information. That's how we like survive in society. However, to press pause and say, what is like the value statement I'm jumping to, and how can I actually look at the behavior and just get curious about the behavior and wonder, where do I show up on the spectrum? Where might someone else be showing up on the very same spectrum? And could that be another way to assign? Okay, time, our favorites. Monochronic versus polychronic. So on one end of the spectrum, you have monochronic, mono, one. Monochronic cultures like to do one thing at a time. Take time appointments very seriously. To respect someone is to respect their time. And you show up on time to everything. There's in US culture / sports culture is early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable. And if you show up late to your basketball practice, you will run for a very long time. Scientific law in the US. Okay, polychronic, so poly multiple. So in a polychronic culture, it's very common to have multiple things going on at any given time, right? It's just a little bit more fluid. There's a little bit more of this willingness to change plans often and easily, because if you're both in a polychronic culture, you're going to show up late, but you also know the person you're meeting is going to show up late. So it's like not bad, because that's just the way it is, okay? That's the way it happens. What's interesting here is that it says that people tend to be the main concern. I like to qualify this statement because it's really people in both settings, but it's just the way that it's expressed is so different. So if I am running late to an appointment on campus, and let's say I run into my good friends, if we're both in a monochronic society, I might be like, oh my gosh, hi, it's so good to see you. I'm running late, but let's catch up later, okay? And then he might be like, oh my gosh, go, go, go. Because if we're both monochronic, we both value time. They don't want me to be late to my appointment either. So it's like, okay, great. If I'm in a polychronic setting, I would be like, oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. How's your summer? We might talk for like 10, 15 minutes because the person I'm meeting is also going to be like 10, 15, 20 minutes late, right? Like it's okay. And so this idea is like you're respecting people in both scenarios, but the way you're respecting them looks different. And if you have grown up and not left your current context, a lot of you have left your context that you grew up in, so you already have a certain awareness of this. A lot of people that you might meet at UC San Diego perhaps have never left their main context. They may not have the same awareness. And so if you have grown up in a certain context where you're like, time is respect, to respect me, respect my time, to show up late, that might translate into a first impression that you're not even meaning to give. And we have different expectations for different appointments. So you might think, okay, American society is typically more monochronic. That's what it's known to be. And you might think, okay, so the US is more monochronic. I'm going to show up early to everything. But I'm also going to show up early to the first college party. And that could be very awkward for you. Because for our professional appointments, you show up early, but for our social appointments, there is a thing as fashionably late. And so you want to come late, you don't want to be in like how early is too early? So this idea of if you're coming to interview, yes, maybe you want to be like 15 minutes early, but typically you don't want to be like an hour early or an hour and a half. Like I was interviewing for a position and the front desk messaged me and they're like, oh, like your candidate has arrived and it was 2 hours before the interview time. And I was like, cool, they can wait. Because like I literally have interviews up until that time, right? And so there's almost this idea of like what is too early. That being said, if you're fine waiting, I'm fine with some waiting, right? I also know that like for some people, they'll show up to an interview, see where it is, realize they're an hour and a half late early, and then just go, okay, now that I know where it is, I'm gonna like sit in my car until it's ready, and then 20 minutes, I'll like walk in and be like, hello, here I am, all prepared. So I think our understanding of time, and I think it's also helpful to just start to like verbalize and articulate what is my home context culture, and then also what is the context of UC San Diego. Because UC San Diego very much has its own culture, it has its own norms, and it has its own expectations. And so I encourage you that like as you're talking to people, if you're an undergrad student, you probably have an OL or an RA. I give these trainings to them as well, so hopefully they all know what you're talking about. But it's really interesting to say, like, in your experience, what has been your experience with UC San Diego as it pertains to time, as it pertains to communications? Like, what is appropriate in this given context? Because that helps you just better navigate these things that we don't often talk about, but are really helpful once you start to verbalize. Okay, I think we only have two more. I'm kind of blasting through these. Typically, I like to do more discussion, but I know that we're running a little bit over. I'm like stressed about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, people have places to be. If you stay until 1:30, let's say the session goes until 1:30, and you're here for the FCCR, I will validate you for an hour and a half for the FCCR. If you have places you need to go, go. I'm monochronic, so I want you to be. Okay, so power distance. So power distance index essentially refers to how power is distributed in a certain society and how acceptable it is in that society. So a good metaphor or analogy for this is often US college classrooms. So in a high power distance society, the power distance between someone in authority and someone under their authority is quite significant. And typically, a high power distance index, you'll see more of a teacher-centered learning model in a classroom. Because the professor has the PhD, has been published, has the research. So there's quite a bit of distance between the professor and the pupil, the student. And so, because they have the knowledge and the experience, it's almost going to be like a funnel. And my job is to take that information and transmit it to you. And typically, a successful student means that you are able to like memorize that information and also like regurgitate that information when needed. So like on the test, right? In a low power distance index, the power between someone in authority and under their authority is much smaller. Because yes, the professor has, been published, has the research, has the PhD, but the student also has their own life experience and their own knowledge and their own beliefs. So while that power distance is still there, it's much smaller. And typically, you'll see more of a student-centered learning model because there's going to be a lot more back and forth. There's going to be a lot more of, the professor might say, this is my idea or my opinion, and you might hear a student say, I don't know, I see it differently. If you're coming from a teacher-centered learning model, you might be like, we're gonna fail. However, let's say you're coming from a teacher-centered learning model and you come to a student-centered learning context, and it's like the first time I'm like, all right, everyone, today we're having a debate. You're gonna be side A, you're gonna be side B, I'm on side A. Tell us why we're wrong. And if you're side B, you're like, no. I know you knew about the grades, so that just does not feel like a great interest to me. And yeah, you're going to see a lot more for a lot of international students. The amount of participation that's required in a US classroom is typically a lot higher than the amount of participation that was required in maybe if you're a grad student, like your university, your undergrad experience. It might have been all like tests for your K through 12 or your undergrad, and now you're going to have to do all these like projects, and you're going to have participation points. And students are like, what is participation points? It's like, what is that? That's a very American concept in a lot of ways. You also can see this on the student affairs side. So we have different programs like Dine with the Dean, Coffee with a Prof. If you haven't heard about this, you should ask about it because they're actually great programs. But if you think about it, these are all programs designed to make our authority figures more approachable. So this idea that we are going to pay for you to have coffee with your dean makes our dean more approachable. Or like coffee with or dine with the dean, coffee with a prof, like we're going to pay for you to go have lunch with your professor because we don't want you to be scared about approaching your professor. Again, a very concentrated effort that's reflective of our low power distance index society. So, or you might say like, oh, go to office hours. You should go to office hours. Even if you don't have a question, just go to office hours. For some folks, they're like, so you want me to go to office hours, not have a question, but just go. And they're like, and you're like, what? Why? I'm literally just wasting your time. Like I'm just like, hey. But again, it's like very reflective of a much more lower power distance index. Where to even introduce yourself, say your name, and make that face-to-face connection is much more reflective potentially of like American culture. Okay, this will be our final one. So our final one is conversation rhythms. So conversation rhythms refers to how much silence is quote unquote common in any given conversation. You have like 4 different conversations represented on the screen. In conversation 1, let's say the top line is person A speaking and the bottom line is person B speaking. Person A is speaking and there's quite a bit of this pause before person B is speaking. Conversation 2, person A is speaking, a quick beat of silence before person B starts speaking. In conversation 3, there's a little bit of overlap. And then in conversation 4, they're maybe talking over each other. If you were to rate what is a quote unquote normal conversation for you, so let's say growing up with friends or on the dinner table, I want you to tell me, I'm going to go down the line, and this goes for our online folks too. Where would you rate yourself? So conversation 1, 2, 3, or 4. How many of you would rate yourself as a conversation 1? That's a number. Okay. How many of you would rate yourself as a conversation 2? Okay, okay. What about conversation 3? Conversation 4? Yes. I love my honesty. Okay, so growing up, I for sure was raised in a conversation 4 home. Like that, in my family, if you like pause to breathe, you were done speaking. I'm sorry. I will also talk about it as if it was like if you're music theory, there was like a deep crescendo and a crescendo. Like someone was winding down while someone else was winding up, right? Or if you're like a sports person and if you're running a relay race, there's a time where you're both holding the baton, something like that. So that's truly what I thought was just like, whoa, like, oh, that's how you make sense. When I went to school, I realized that not everyone loves it when you talk over them. So I would get so excited and someone would be saying to me, I was like, oh yeah, totally, me too. And then I would start talking. And their nonverbals were not always the best. And so then I think I became a little bit more conversation 3 once I was like, I don't think everyone loves it. So then when I graduated from university, one of my first real jobs in the workforce is I had moved to China and I taught English at university there, and I taught English conversation and American culture. So that was my class. And let me tell you that that class was a struggle. And I, international relations major, studying intercultural communication, thought I had some idea. But that first semester, I could not get anyone to talk. And in an English conversation class, that is not good. Bad job. And what was hard is that all of my students had studied English K through 12. So in terms of reading and writing, they were fine. You know what I mean? So the whole point of this class was truly pronunciation, comfortability in speaking, using idioms, using colloquialisms. And yet no one would talk. And I was like, I'm gonna get fired. And so at the end of my first semester, I pulled aside a student that I had gotten close with, and I was like, listen, this is painful for all of us. So if you have any feedback you can give me, I am listening. Please tell me. And my student, was like, well, professor, I'm not a professor, but they called me that, and I was like, she's like, well, professor, sometimes you don't know when you're done talking. And I was like, because if you think about it, I would run a class and I would do something like, okay, folks, today we're talking about food. Now, I love food. Go ahead and shout out, what are some of your favorite foods? Okay, that's okay, we'll get to that. I love pizza. Can anyone tell me how a Chicago pizza is different from a New York pizza? That's okay, that's a very American question, my bad. Because as a US American, my comfortability with silence was 0 to maybe 2 seconds. That is how I thought a normal conversation flowed. Whereas I was interacting with students where their comfortability with silence was perhaps much more in the 3 to 5 second range. And because multiple dimensions can be interacting at a given time, power distance is also a thing. So they're not going to cut off their teacher so that they can speak over them to share their answer. However, one second, Karina will be with you. However, you also can think that, let's say if you were me, you can think, well, I just have a disengaged class. You're not motivated to talk to me. And so if you don't get curious about these concepts, you might make these first impressions or these assumptions that may not actually be true. And so I think a lot of the times, I picture someone from conversation 4 talking with someone from conversation 1 for the first time, right? And you can just imagine what that's like. Because conversation 4 might be thinking, I am carrying this conversation on my shoulders. I'm doing all the talking, I'm asking all the questions. Do something. Like, this is heavy. Please, give me some. I'm like talking to a brick wall. You there? Like, what's happening, right? If your conversation won, you might be thinking, do I even need to be here? Should I go get a coffee, come back? You'll still be talking. I'm not really sure what our relationship is. And so again, it's really interesting to think about, like at what point, oftentimes your first impression from that interaction might be, this person is so overbearing, they're like so aggressive, they're not interested in what I have to say. And this person might be thinking, this person is so boring. Like they have nothing to offer. Like I'm working so hard and they're doing nothing. However, when we start to like pause and be like, all right, I'm interacting with a new person and I'm feeling some type of way. I wonder why that is. And granted, there are people like all those things can still be at place, but it's also interesting to get curious. Like knowing that I'm from more of a conversation for a family, I will literally to this day be in conversation with someone, and I have to, especially if I get excited, I talk faster. And so I'll have to tell myself, Grace, shut up. Grace, shut up. Because I have to ask myself, am I creating enough space in this conversation in which the other person feels like they can actually participate? And if our understandings of what silence is normal are different, I want to make sure that they actually feel like there's enough room for them to be involved. Okay, that is going to be a lot of the content, you could say, for today. I'm going to run through and do a few closing slides, and then I'm free until 1:30 to hang out and chat. If you need to go. No, don't be. I'm taking your time. I'm very monochronic. Okay, how many of you have heard of our meetups? Some of you. Great. For those of you who don't know, we are hosting meetups during international orientation. So we have two kinds of meetups. One are regionally based and one is interest-based. So let's say you want to meet other students from Europe. Let's say you want to meet students, other students. For Asia, we have several, because a lot of our students come from China and India and all that good stuff. You could also attend meetups that are different regions of your own. So maybe you want to meet folks from your same home region. Maybe you want to meet folks from a different region. You should go to some regional meetups. I think that there are like 2 tonight. And then we also have interest group meetups. So maybe you want to meet other people who, I think we have like a photography meetup, a hiking meetup, a cooking meetup. Like we have tons of different interest groups. And so this could be a cool way for you just to meet people who share those similar interests. Who's heard of our IMN's calendar? Yeah, that's fun. Like, see. Okay, so our IMN's calendar is obviously very active during orientation, but this is a year-long live calendar, which means this fall we'll put our events up there. As you can see, we're orientation. But a lot of our campus partners will put events on there, and a lot of our student boards will put events on there. So a lot of students I know bookmark this page, and if they're bored, they're like, what's happening this weekend? They'll go to iEvents and be like, I want to go snorkeling, sure, and that's how they'll find out and sign up for different events. So this is a really helpful resource. If you're participating in the Get CCR, how many of you know about the Get CCR? Oh, okay. Is that my next slide? Okay, it's not. I'm going to take a hot minute to look at the CCR. The Get CCR stands for the Globally Engaged Tritons Co-Curricular Record. So in the same way, when you graduate from university, you're going to have your academic transcript, right? It's going to list all your classes. So your co-curricular record is the complement to your transcript, but it's going to list all the activities you're involved in during your time at UC San Diego, but it's validated by the university. So when you request a transcript, you can also request your CCR. So it's like a very official record. A lot of students might use it, one, if they're undergrad and they want to get their first job, they'll put it as a professional experience. Some students will use it when applying for professional school, grad school, sometimes for work. It's the university's way of saying we acknowledge that learning takes place both inside and outside the classroom. So your transcript validates learning that takes place inside the classroom. Your CCR validates learning that takes place outside the classroom. So in the same way that you have different courses on your transcript, you have different activities on your CCR. One of those activities is the Get CCR, the Globally Engaged Tritons. So if you are involved in different events, fun fact, all of the sessions during this week are typically eligible for Get CCR credit. So by attending today, you just earn an hour to an hour and a half towards your Get CCR. Congratulations. If you went to coffee hour, that's also an hour towards your Get CCR. I mean, but you can also search. I think this is actually not a PowerPoint. Okay, I'm gonna take a hot minute to do this. So one, if you want to learn more, it's literally just get CCR ucsd.edu. That's where you can learn more and kind of like sign up. It kind of says what I just told you, but you can also go to iEvents and you can utilize the tag feature, which means you can click on this tag and now you can see all the events that are eligible for Get CCR credit. So like this, you're at right now, if you went to coffee hour, let's say you want to go to building social confidence later this afternoon. Let's say you're a grad student and you want to go to the social this evening. Like so for your Get CCR, you need 30 hours over the course of the academic year. You could earn like 10, 15 just through orientation alone. Okay, so this is a good time while you're not in class if you want to do that. The other thing is like, I know some students, and I don't hate it, that's why you show up early and you register, will say, free food provided. And they will attend all the events that offer free food. I don't hate the game, you know what I mean? If you can play the game, play the game. So that is a tag feature. If you're curious of like, oh, I want to meet people in person, you can start to see what are in-person events. So that's like, just know that the iEvents calendar is a very interactive calendar and it's live, which means people are adding to it all the time. So what we might be there today, tomorrow, the student board could add their like each bonfire, you know what I mean? Okay. All right. Last thing. Reminder, so to register for other like workshops and events and sessions, our website is iorientationucsd.com. There's a lot of ways you can contact with our office. Follow us on ISPO on Instagram. We might be doing some giveaways. And here is the survey. Oh, I would say that if you are even interested in doing the Get CCR, you should fill out the survey because that's how you'll get credit. So everyone take a hot minute, scan the QR code, fill out the survey. All right, is everyone done? Need a minute or so? It looks like folks are maybe just another minute. Okay, cool. So make sure you do the survey. Love it. I love when someone comes to the front to do the survey. That's like, I love it. Okay. Please continue to complete the survey. You need to complete the survey. Okay, so yeah. That is all I have for today. Thank you so much for attending. On your way out, please do grab some food. Again, come early and register for the session. But it was so great to meet you. If I didn't get a chance to like speak your name or meet you face to face, I would love to do that. So feel free to come up and introduce yourself. But I also know that y'all are busy people, have lots of things to go to. So have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.